Now, when I wrote this story for Canadian Business called Firewater, which was about Jessica Ernst and the whole issue of fracking of CBF, my editors got calls from the ERCB, and they said, "What are you doing running this story? Don't you know that Andrew Nikiforuk is a hick journalist who couldn't get a job at a rural newspaper even if he tried?" I kid you not. What they did not know is that I had worked with the editor for 20 years and the managing editor for another 20 years. And they thought they could get these guys to censor this story. That's your regular ed work. We know, this is from Dave Hughes, and a report he did on fracking, that if you look at tight sand, Burnett Shale, you see their CO2 production is 2 to 3 times greater than that of fugitive emissions, or 2 to 3 times that greater than conventional oil and gas operations. In other words, developing a shale gas field or a tight oil field could be dirtier in terms of CO2 emissions and methane leaks than building coal fire plants. Now here's a fact that'll blow your mind. The BC Horns River play, which is 12% CO2, so you've got to strip that CO2 from this gas before you can use it. All right, the estimates are that if you were to produce all the gas in that field, you'll end up with 600 million tons of CO2. You know, the province of British Columbia produces 69 million tons a year. You produce this field and British Columbia will not be able to have any climate change program whatsoever. Toxicity and health. Chemicals used in hydraulic fracking. Again, no transparency here in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, although I think BC might release some stuff next week. Gallons of hydraulic fracturing fluids containing a carcinogen, containing BTU, which is a really nasty blood thinner. 32 million gallons of diesel fuel in 19 states between 2005 and 2009, which is, by American standards, illegal, and that is the greatest threat to groundwater. Theo Colburn in Colorado, she's looked at the stuff they use for natural gas production, and she's cataloged them. She looked at 353 chemicals, and she found that 80% will cause skin, eye, and sensory organ damage, respiratory damage, gastrointestinal and liver damage, brain and nervous system damage, about 50% of these chemicals, and on it goes. What about our experience here? Well, we've had experience with shallow fracking, and how did the government respond, and what did we learn? This all had to do with the coal bed methane development, very rapid development, and this is a very shallow formation directly below the baseline, groundwater baselines in central Alberta. In the space of a decade, we drilled more than 10,000 wells. We did so without any cumulative impact studies, and we did so without any groundwater studies. And so what were the water concerns at the time? Well, if you take the water out of these coal seams, you're going to draw down aquifers. The methane will migrate into aquifers, causing and due to casing failures in these wells. There'll be contamination of wells with hydraulic fracking fluids, and we'll release saline waters into rivers. And what do we know about our groundwater at the same time? Before we even did this, groundwater is the principal water supply for 30% of Canadians, 600,000 Albertans, by the way. Yet here's NRCan saying we don't know anything about it. Ironically, the current state of knowledge of the resource is inversely proportional to its importance. Here's the well density in the province. As you can see, that we have the greatest concentration of groundwater wells for sources for drinking waters in the very area that they fracked for coal bed methane. We have among the highest density of wells, period, in the world. So you've got to keep that, that's a critical issue. We know that at that time you could go to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania would tell you, well, there's your coal bed, and here's all the ways that methane can leak to the surface if you frack the hell out of it. And grass migration, this idea of stray methane, Serious problem in 1 out of 20 wells in the province. Regulators remain in a state of denial about it. I mean, only inspecting 5 wells. Here's Maurice Dussault, perhaps one of the top guys in the oil patch, marvelous man. We haven't been good stewards of our groundwater near gas wells. I feel the EUB and other provincial regulatory agencies have been lax in protecting groundwater. Now, when I wrote this story for Canadian Business called Firewater, which was about Jessica Ernst and the whole issue of fracking of CBF, my editors got calls from the ERCB, and they said, "What are you doing running this story? Don't you know that Andrew Nikiforuk is a hick journalist who couldn't get a job at a rural newspaper even if he tried?" I kid you not. What they did not know is that I had worked with the editor for 20 years and the managing editor for another 20 years. And they thought they could get these guys to censor this story. That's your regulator at work. More on gas migration. It's just a huge issue. Anyway, a lot of people ended up being able to do this with their water in central Alberta. And some people ended up blowing up their entire water wells altogether because of the gas migrating in there. This was the case in northern Alberta, 2006, Bruce Jack. 3 people were injured in this explosion. Here's Jessica Ernst, who's soon going to be telling her story about what all happened. The Singer well, these are just some of the contaminants found in that well: butane, propane, lots of methane. Campbell well, nitrogen, methane, hydrogen sulfide. In Rosebud itself, ethane, propane, butane, toluene, naphthalene. As Carlos Mullenbachs, one of the world's experts on isotopic analysis, said, unless someone throws a big lighter down the well, it's a sure sign of contamination. Industry and governments were told to do baseline groundwater monitoring before. They did not. And it didn't start until 2006. At that point, there was no baseline. It had already been contaminated. We had the Alberta Research Council do a really shitty investigation that was not peer-reviewed, that did admit that Alberta Environment does not have a specific and documented response process to check out methane contamination in your water well, and that their conclusion was, well, energy development projects, despite the fact that Alberta Environment doesn't know what the hell they're doing or even how to measure any of this stuff, it probably didn't affect any of these wells. Mullenbachs said, that's bullshit. These guys don't know what they're doing. They haven't done the proper analyses. They haven't looked at the full data. They haven't recognized that they'd already contaminated the baseline by allowing all of this activity. They ignored key ethane data. They ignored the CBM fingerprint data. And we find the overall conclusion of the Alberta Research Council to be premature. So where do we go from here? Well, here's some of what some groups are saying. Here's the Munk Center at the University of Toronto did an excellent paper on fracking. They said, look, we've got to study the aquifers. Prior to doing this, we need full public disclosure of fluids. We need well integrity tests. We need water allocations, not by the energy regulator, but by somebody who actually cares about water. We need a fracking tax to pay for groundwater monitoring, and we need no-go zones. You can't do this everywhere. Don't even think about doing it everywhere. And don't do it without full public participation of the community involved.
Right.